Welcome back to another episode of Offbeat Adventures. We're standing here on the grade, once again, of the former Canadian Northern Railway and later Canadian National Railways, Dorion, and then subsequently Kinghorn Subdivision. We're just to the west, I'll try to get behind the tree here, just to the west of what is known as Birch Beach Road, here in the municipality of Shunya. We're just off of something called Lakeshore Drive, and basically, this is one of the access roads that runs down to Lake Superior. And so we're picking up where we left off on a previous hike. And so we're going to be working our way from this road here, actually crossing several roads as we work our way west, all the way to another road crossing, which is known as Mackenzie Beach Road. And so our journey today is going to take us about, it's about 4.5 miles or so. It's a little bit longer hike. It's kind of a nice day. It's not particularly warm. I started the hike this morning. It was 0 Celsius. I just checked now, and it's saying that it's 2. There is a bit of wind today. It's the 3rd week in October, and so you can see that pretty much all of the trees have lost their leaves, and even the tamaracks are starting to turn yellow and lose their needles. It was a little bit cloudier, and now the sun is starting to come out, which is nice, but also creates some issues too with shadows and things like that. So we got our first little thing coming up here. It's a bit of a cool north wind, and so I'm bundled up here. I have my gloves on, I have my skull cap, and it's sort of keeping me warm. So our first little thing here is we do have a culvert here. It's a modern metal culvert, but we don't have a lot of mileage indicators here. There's not very many milepost markers on this section of line. Excuse me. And so the mileage here on this creek, and you can see it kind of flowing to the south here, is 177.67. And that is the mileage on the Kinghorn subdivision. And there were 2 previous lines, as I mentioned, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So what we have to do to calculate the mileage for the original lines, because the original line started in Jellicoe as opposed to the Kinghorn, which started in Long Lac. So we have to subtract 49.7 miles. And so that becomes 127.97. So hopefully my math is right there. Yeah, 127.97 on the Canadian Northern Railway Nipigon subdivision and the Canadian National Railways Dorion subdivision. All right, so we'll hop back up on the bike here. And speaking of those things, we'll take a moment here to do our usual history lesson. So this line was built by Canadian Northern Railway between 1911 and 1914, and this was going to be one of the final pieces in Canadian Northern's transcontinental ambitions. The Canadian Northern Railway had got its start way back in the late 1890s. They began kind of acquiring some lines in Manitoba, and also some sort of unused charters. And their first sort of big construction project was building a line from the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, and Thunder Bay is just to the west of us, all the way to Winnipeg. And that line was built between 1899 and 1902, and basically the idea was they were going to provide an alternative to the Canadian Pacific Railway. So after they reached Winnipeg, Canadian Northern started building lines all throughout the prairies, and then they also started constructing north from Toronto, and eventually reaching the Sudbury area. And it was around this time that the owners of Canadian Northern Railway, the principals, Sir William Mackenzie and Sir Donald Mann, realized that in order for the company to be viable long term, they would have to have a transcontinental line. Now, they were not particularly keen on building some of the sections of that transcontinental line, in particular the section between the Sudbury area, specifically Ruel and Port Arthur, because it was going to be very, very difficult to build. It was going to be very expensive, and they didn't think it was going to generate a lot of revenue. And so what they tried to do is they tried to negotiate a running rights agreement with Canadian Pacific Railway. And they tried for a number of years to do that, and unfortunately they weren't able to come to some sort of agreement. And so eventually Canadian Northern was forced to build the line between Ruel and Port Arthur. And again, that line was completed in 1914, with the last spike being driven on New Year's Day 1914, and the line opening for traffic in 1950. Now unfortunately, Canadian Northern didn't really get to enjoy the fruits of their labor for very long. By the time they opened the line for traffic, the company was already in big financial difficulty, and those issues were exacerbated by World War I and some of the mounting construction costs, in particular building this section and then building some of their sections through the mountains of British Columbia. Here's another culvert, but there's no marker. It was kind of interesting as we work our way through the section. This is kind of a bit of a quieter section. There's not really a lot of big kind of features on here. The first part here, there's quite a number of culverts. There's a lot of culvert markers, and then towards the end, there's nothing. There's no culvert markers. So it's just kind of weird to sort of see that, but this one doesn't have a marker here. And so eventually by 1917, the company was so strapped for cash that they basically had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And sorry, I'm just looking here. There's supposed to be somewhere around here is supposed to be milepost 78, but I don't see. I've looked, but I don't see the marker. The markers around in this area kind of seem to be hit and miss. There's the odd one, but really, a lot of them are missing the milepost markers. Here's a tie plate right here. And so, as I was saying with my story, the railway line had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And in 1918, Canadian Northern was forced to merge or amalgamate, or however you want to term the arrangement, with a bunch of other Canadian government-owned bankrupt lines that were known as the Canadian Government Railways. And that merger produced Canadian National Railways. And that agreement, that company, the nationalization process was finished 5 years later in 1923 with the absorption of the Grand Trunk lines. I'm just going to walk through here because there's a rock cut and we have a little stop coming up here in a second here. So you can see this rock cut's not particularly long and it's not particularly high. It's only probably about 3 feet high. There's a little bit of rock work in this section. So in 1923, the name of this line changed. Originally, it had been the Nipigon Subdivision of Canadian Northern Railway. And then when it became part of Canadian National, it became the Canadian National Railways, Nipigon Subdivision. And then in 1923, it became the Dorion Subdivision of Canadian National Railways. And that continued up until 1960, and in 1960 Canadian National Railways changed their name. They adopted kind of the more CN, the Canadian National Railway title, and introduced the CN kind of logo, and they decided to basically merge the two subdivisions, the Dorion and the more easterly Kinghorn subdivision, into one line. Both of these lines had basically been relegated to secondary status after the opening of the Nakina Cutoff in 1925. And so the whole line became the Kinghorn subdivision, and that arrangement continued until 2005, when Canadian National decided to discontinue service on this line. And eventually the rails were ripped up, and that happened between 2008 and 2010. All right, so we've arrived at another point of interest here. So what we have is a little creek crossing, and it's got a rather interesting culvert. And so what we're going to do is we'll drop down and go take a look at what's happening here. All right, so we've made our way over here to the northern side of this little creek crossing here, which you can just see here. Again, not too much water considering the amount of rain that we've had lately, but again, it could have been that this is very, very dry to begin with, and this just kind of brought up the water level. It could have been completely bone dry a little while ago. So what we have, if I step back again, is we have this very, very interesting metal culvert. I think it's the only one that I've ever seen so far on this line, and I've done pretty much most of the line. There's not too much left to go. I've done over, well, at least 3/4 of the line. I've never seen a culvert like this. You can see the conduit here for the fiber, and you could just see this very, very unusual metal culvert. I'd never even seen one even in pictures before, and then not too long ago I saw one. Somebody had posted one somewhere on social media, and so I was like, hey, I recognize that. That's this metal culvert here that's by Amethyst Station. And so you can see the inside here, and what we'll do is we'll try to carefully work our way through. And so you can see just basically it's like this steel ribbed design. Nice little echo going in here. Gotta watch my footing. Look back to the north there. And again, it's kind of interesting why they use this just here and sort of nowhere else. So you can sort of pan back here and you can kind of see the opening. I'll try to get a little bit further back, but I don't know how much further back I can get because the water's kind of deep here. I'll try. Not kill myself as I make my way back down again. All right, so you can kind of see the opening here. Again, just a very, very unusual culvert. Again, nothing like this anywhere I've ever seen on the line. So curious to know why it was put in here and kind of nowhere else. Okay, so let's turn this thing off here and we'll hop back up on the grade and just continue our journey to the west.